Have you ever tried to eat healthier, quit smoking, exercise more, or the like? If we want to make changes in our lives, it usually means overcoming established habits, and that is certainly not easy. What's the deal with habits anyway? How do they work? Charles Duhigg answers those questions in his book, The Power of Habit. And today, we'll take a look at that. Welcome to the Soft Skill channel. My name is Sebastian Jung, and today I'd like to present The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. Duhigg is a reporter who writes for the New Yorker magazine, formerly also the New York Times. In 2013, he received the Pulitzer Prize for explanatory reporting for a series of articles about business practices of Apple and other tech companies. And during his work, he came into contact with the topic of habits, and that seems to have fascinated him quite a lot because he ended up writing a book about them. The Power of Habit was published in 2012, and it seems to have been quite successful. The cover claims 1 million copies sold. To me, it seems rather obvious that this book was written by a journalist because it focuses heavily on storytelling. The book is divided into 3 parts: habits of individuals, habits of successful organizations, and habits of societies. I will focus on the first part and mostly skip the third. And the book is divided into a total of 9 chapters. Step by step, during those chapters, how habits work is explored and explained, with each chapter adding another piece to the puzzle. And each puzzle piece is presented by stories that act as examples. Now, obviously, I can only mention a few of those stories and only briefly. So let's have a look. In the first part, habits of individuals, and the very first chapter, we get to know Eugene Pauly. Eugene Pauly's brain has suffered massive damage due to an infection, and because of this he was not able to generate any new memories. He would forget everything after a couple of seconds. For example, Duhigg describes how he would get up and introduce himself to doctors and nurses each time they entered the room, even if he had spoken to them just a few minutes earlier, even if they had known him for years. But he was still able to form new habits. And there is an example that demonstrates this very well, where Eugene was interviewed by a scientist in his living room. And the family had moved after his illness, so he had no memories of the house. And the scientist asked him where the kitchen was or the bathroom, and Eugene was not able to tell him. He just didn't know. However, if Eugene got hungry, he would get up, walk into the kitchen, open a drawer, take out a jar of nuts, and return to his seat. And if he needed to go to the bathroom, he would get up and go there and return. But even after his return, he was still unable to tell the scientist where the kitchen or the bathroom was. This illustrates an important point. A lot of the things we do each day, a lot of our actions, are merely habits, not the result of conscious thought. The blueprint for habits, the basic formula how habits work, was discovered in experiments with rats, and it is called the habit loop. It works like this. We perceive a clue. Then we perform the routine that we have learned, and at the end, we get a reward. Oh, reward sounds nice. We learn more about that in the second chapter. Why do we brush our teeth? What do you think? Because dentists recommend it? Well, that's what I would have thought, but what about flossing? Dentists recommend that as well, and a lot of people don't do it. According to Charles Duhigg, we brush our teeth due to a successful marketing campaign by Pepsodent that was created by one Claude Hopkins in the USA in the early 1900s. That was a time when most Americans didn't brush their teeth. And Hopkins wanted to create a habit. He appealed to the mechanisms that make up a habit. He told people that there is a film on their teeth and you can feel it if you touch your teeth with your tongue. By the way, this film is really there, but it is perfectly natural and harmless. So if you feel this film, it means your teeth aren't clean and you need to brush them with Pepsodent toothpaste. And if you perform this routine, you will be rewarded with an attractive smile. And it worked. Pepsodent was a great success. But that's not the entire truth, because in the past, before Pepsodent, similar marketing campaigns had failed. But there was an important difference. Pepsodent contained certain ingredients, such as mint oil or citric acid. Those were intended to give the toothpaste a nice, fresh taste. However, they had an unintended side effect. They created a fresh, cool, tingling sensation in your mouth after using the toothpaste. Why do we stick to habits? We develop a strong craving for that reward at the end. People came to expect this tingling, cool sensation after using the toothpaste. They even got the impression that their teeth were not really clean unless they felt this cool tingling. Duhigg describes a very interesting experiment with monkeys. A monkey had to press a button at the right time when some image appeared on a monitor, and then he was rewarded with some sweet juice. And the monkey's brain activity was recorded. And it turned out, after the monkey received the juice, the reward center in the brain was activated, as is to be expected. However, after they continued performing this experiment, after pressing the button, receiving the juice, after this whole procedure became a habit more and more, this activation of the reward center occurred earlier and even earlier, until the reward center was activated right after perceiving the clue. And that's why it is so difficult to get rid of habits, why we stick to habits. Right after we perceive the clue, we expect the reward and we have a strong craving for that reward. If the monkey didn't receive the juice after perceiving the clue, it would get quite frustrated. And that's how it works for us as well. So, how can we change habits? How can we get rid of bad habits? Duhigg tells more interesting stories in the third chapter. For example, about a coach who led a hopeless football team to win the Super Bowl by relying on habits, or about the man who founded Alcoholics Anonymous, who used habits to get people away from drinking. However, I think the most helpful story is about a young woman called Mandy, young graduate student, who excessively bit her nails. Quite a bad habit. She did it to the point where her fingers would start bleeding and where there would be nerve damage. So it was a really severe problem. And she had tried everything. She had tried to exert willpower to stop the nail biting. She had tried to use foul tasting polish, but nothing worked. Until she received therapy. Habit reversal training, to be exact, a form of cognitive behavioral therapy. There she finally got rid of her bad habit. So how did this work? How can we get rid of bad habits? The bad news is we can't actually get rid of bad habits. We can only change habits. By following a certain formula, we have to keep the cue and we have to keep the reward, but insert a new routine. And that's what happened in Mandy's therapy. So first, of course, the therapist had to figure out the cue. What happened before Mandy started biting her nails? How did she feel? Now, this is a difficult question because often, if we have stick to habits for a long time, we aren't really aware of the cue anymore. In this case, it turned out that it was a slight tension Mandy felt in her fingers. The therapist asked her to carry around an index card and make a check mark each time she felt that slight tension and started biting her nails, and this made Mandy acutely aware of the situations where she did the nail biting. For example, it turned out that she would usually do it in situations where she was bored. Next, it was important to figure out the reward. Here it turned out that it was a brief stimulation. After going through all the nails and biting all of them, Mandy felt a brief sense of completeness, a brief stimulation. So finally, a new routine had to be established. The therapist asked Mandy to write when she felt this slight tension in her fingers, to put her hands in her pockets or to grab a pencil, something like that, something that would prevent her from starting the nail biting right away. And then to find a way to get a brief physical stimulation, such as rubbing her arm or wrapping her knuckles on the desk, a brief physical stimulation instead of the nail biting. And he asked her to continue carrying around that index card, to continue making check marks for slight tension and nail biting, but in addition to make a hash mark each time she was able to successfully override the habit, override the nail biting with this replacement routine. And after a while, after a few weeks, there were more hash marks than check marks, and after about a month, the nail biting was finally gone for good. There is another important aspect to changing habits that is better illustrated by the other stories in this chapter, and that is in order to change a habit, you have to believe that you are able to. You have to believe that you are able to change. The second part of the book deals with the habits of successful organizations, because organizations have habits as well, often referred to as routines. And there are actually quite a lot of them, and they play a major role in how an organization actually works. There are 4 chapters in this second part, but I will only talk briefly about 2 of them. First of all, some habits are more important than others. Those are called Keystone Habits, and they are explored in chapter 4. Here Duhigg tells the story of Paul O'Neill and Alcoa. Alcoa, the aluminium company of America, was in trouble in 1987, and Paul O'Neill took over as CEO to set things right. And he had a clear strategy for doing that. He focused entirely on safety. This was quite confusing to the investors. They expected business management buzzwords like synergy or right sizing, but the guy just said, I want to make Alcoa one of the safest companies in America. And that he did. He managed to do so. When O'Neill retired in 2000, Alcoa really was one of the safest companies in America. You were more likely to get injured in some office job than at Alcoa, where you worked with molten metal. But that wasn't all. The annual net income of Alcoa also was 5 times larger than before O'Neill's arrival. So, even though we had just focused on one area, on safety, the positive effects had spilled over to our other areas. Duhigg describes different mechanisms that helped to achieve this. For example, safety was an issue everybody could agree on, both the unions and the executives. So Duhigg managed to find something that made everybody work together towards a common goal. Or another example is that a safer production process also means a better, more reliable production process, which also leads to higher quality and lower costs and less problems. Communication channels that were established for better safety also helped the company to get an edge towards the competition. There is a nice anecdote. O'Neill gave his personal phone number to employees and told them, "You can call me if you have suggestions about safety." And they called him with all kinds of suggestions. And there were some great ideas there. Some idea concerning the manufacturing process that was actually implemented saved Alcoa millions. So O'Neill managed to improve the overall situation of the company by focusing on just one aspect. And Keystone Habits work pretty much the same way for individuals. There are plenty of examples throughout the book. Just to name one, there are studies about regular habitual exercise, and they show that people who habitually exercise, even if it is just once a week, that they tend to also eat better, smoke less, be more productive at work, and even be more patient with coworkers and family. A very important aspect of Keystone Habits are small wins. Working on the Keystone Habit should enable you to achieve first small successes, and those will start a kind of upward cycle, upward spiral that will ultimately lead to bigger achievements. Now, the difficult question obviously is, which habits are Keystone Habits? In chapter 5, Duhigg has identified one habit that usually qualifies, and that is willpower. Willpower is an important aspect. Duhigg describes companies and people who became successful by relying on willpower. He describes the story of a guy who was the son of drug addicts, who had dropped out of school, who was not even able to keep a job at McDonald's, who became largely successful at Starbucks, becoming the manager of 2 stores and more than 40 employees, because the training program at Starbucks focuses so heavily on willpower. And there is also a Scottish study Duhigg describes about patients in an orthopedic hospital in Scotland who successfully made it through the long and painful rehab process by relying on willpower. Changing habits is certainly difficult, and maybe for organizations even more so than for individuals. However, there is a time when changing habits becomes easier, when changing habits becomes possible, and that is during a crisis. In chapter 6, Duhigg provides some grim examples for such cases. The first is about Rhode Island Hospital, where an internal power struggle between doctors and nurses took place, creating a really toxic work environment that ultimately led to severe accidents. For example, a patient died after an emergency surgery where at first the wrong side of his brain was opened for operation. Another grim example is the Great Fire at the King's Cross station in London in 1987. There, established procedures and routines hindered a timely and effective reaction. For example, the fire department was called way too late, and countermeasures such as a sprinkler system that was there were not used at all. Ultimately, they ended up with 31 dead and dozens injured. At least after those crises, fundamental changes finally were possible. Rhode Island hospital that was formerly a toxic work environment became a great place to work. And in the London Underground, fire safety measures that seemed impossible before were finally implemented and fire safety improved considerably. Apart from changing their own habits, companies are of course quite interested in analyzing and manipulating customer habits. And there is a great example for that in Chapter 7 about Target, the US American retail chain. They collected, or probably still collect, a lot of data from their customers for marketing purposes. Each customer is assigned a guest ID number where all the data from various sources is combined and collected. And this data is used to analyze and manipulate habits. Let's say, for example, there is a customer who buys cereal at Target but no milk. Since people usually have milk with cereal, this person probably buys milk at another store. So Target could try sending this customer some coupons for milk, hoping they will start buying their milk at Target as well. Now, this is a very simple example. Duhigg, however, describes a way more elaborate case where marketing wanted to find out which customers were pregnant. Now, you might wonder why they wanted to know that. Now, the reason is, first of all, scientific research had turned out that our purchasing routines usually change after major life events, such as getting married, getting a divorce, or the birth of a child. At such times, our shopping habits are more malleable, easier to change. And furthermore, parents with small children are obviously great customers anyway, because they are stressed out and sleep deprived, probably have some crying child along with them. They are very insensitive to prices, and they usually buy everything at the same store. So if you can get them to buy their diapers and baby food at Target, they will end up buying everything at Target. So marketing really wanted to know, and they approached data expert Andrew Pohl and asked him to figure it out. Target had some baby shower registration thing where customers could register voluntarily and provide some data, including their due date. And even though only a fraction of the customers actually did that, it gave Pohl a set of data, a pool of data to work with. And he used this data together with his team to figure out patterns, to figure out how the shopping habits of pregnant women changed as the due date approached. And they managed to find plenty of such patterns. For example, around the beginning of the second trimester, pregnant women tend to buy unscented lotion. Or somewhere around the first 20 weeks, they often buy vitamins. And they discovered plenty more such patterns. And knowing those patterns allowed Pohl and his team to predict which customers were pregnant based on their shopping behavior, and even to predict their due date with high accuracy. There is a funny anecdote where an angry father stormed into Target and demanded to see the manager, and he told him, "What's wrong with you people? Are you sick? You sent my underage daughter coupons and advertising for baby food and diapers. What's wrong with you?" And of course the manager apologized. And he called the man again a few days later to apologize again. But the man's attitude had changed by then. He told the manager, "Oh well, it seems there have been things going on in my household that I was not aware of." And it turned out the daughter really was pregnant. Target had figured it out even though her own father did not know. There is another very interesting aspect to this story. What did Target do with their knowledge? Now, what they wanted to do, obviously, was to send pregnant women advertising and coupons for products related to their pregnancy, related to the baby, to make them shop at Target. However, if they would just have done that, those women would have become aware that Target knew about their pregnancy, and they probably would have been a bit upset about that, because it's a pretty big intrusion into their privacy. So what Target did was they mixed in some random products. Say they sent them advertising and coupons for lawnmowers along with diapers, for wine glasses along with baby food. And this gave customers the impression that the advertising actually was random, that they probably received the same coupons as everybody on their street, when actually each advertisement was specifically tailored towards the recipient. This is quite interesting and a bit scary. Part 3 deals with the habits of societies. As I said, I will mostly skip that one. Chapter 8 is about how social movements rely on habits to be successful. In chapter 9, the final chapter, Duhigg raises the question of free will. Do we actually have free will, or are we mainly controlled by our habits? Interesting question. At the end, there is also an afterword and an appendix. Now, afterword, a new one, as it says here, that was added in later editions. There, Duhigg talks about the reception of the book. He tells the story of one reader who had written to him, who was attacked by a shark and severely injured, and the book greatly helped him to get his life back on track. Finally, in the appendix, Duhigg provides brief instructions on how to change habits. There is not really new information in there, because we already learned everything about that throughout the book, but it is briefly summarized to short actionable steps. What you are expected to do is first identify the routine, obviously, then figure out the cue, figure out the reward, and then insert a new routine while keeping cue and reward. So basically the important part is we have to figure out how we can satisfy the same craving in a different way, with a different routine. In this appendix there is, as an example, the chocolate cookie. When he was at work, Duhigg would get up each afternoon and go to the canteen and buy a chocolate cookie, and he wanted to get rid of this habit in favor of his health. And it turned out the cue was simply the time. It always occurred around 3:30. And the reward, as he found out after some experiments, was social contact, because in the canteen he would encounter co-workers and talk to them, and he enjoyed that. So what he ultimately did was he set an alarm on his phone or watch that for 15:30, for 3:30, and then he would visit a colleague and talk to him for a bit to satisfy this craving for social contact, and things worked out fine without the cookie, which seems a bit sad, but it's nice, it worked. Finally, let's proceed to the critique. It is a nice book, quite fun to read, easy to understand. I really enjoyed it. I think this is due to a large part to the journalistic style I mentioned, to this storytelling. It's really fun to read about all those interesting stories. Maybe there is a bit too much emphasis on the stories, because after all, those stories are merely anecdotes. And what really matters is the research. But on the positive side, the research is always there. So it is quite a well-founded book, despite not being written by a scientist. Even though the stories are more flashy, the research is always described as well. And there are detailed notes for all chapters where the sources are listed and everything. And this, by the way, usually includes conversations Duhigg had with the people involved, both in the stories and the research. There are, of course, plenty more stories in the actual book than the few I mentioned. I picked some that are personal favorites of mine, and I picked some I found especially helpful for understanding the concepts, but there are plenty more, of course. I think this book provides a very good understanding of how habits work, and I think it should be quite helpful in dealing with your own habits and especially with changing habits. Maybe it stretches the term habits a bit here and there. For example, I think willpower is more of a concept of its own than something that is specifically related to habits. But, well, yeah, I'm not sure. You can probably argue about that. This specific edition is nice, print, paper quality, everything is fine. Only thing that I find confusing is this cover image with the cute little mouse that is missing its head. That is a bit strange, but apart from that, it's nice. When the video ends, cue. We should all click the like button, routine, and then all be happy, reward. Wouldn't that be a nice habit to establish? We will see each other in the next video. For today, I'll take my leave. Have a nice day. See you next time.